In 1999, 6 teenage boys from Elkhorn Valley vanished after a championship game, their van never reaching home. For over 2 decades, their fate was a chilling void on a mother's doorstep. What followed unearthed forgotten caves, a hidden cult, and the boy who refused to disappear. This isn't just a story of survival, it's a reckoning. Welcome to the full truth behind the pines. It had been 23 years, 4 months, and 12 days since Eloise Roan last heard her son's voice. She had stopped counting after the first decade, after the town stopped whispering and the posters stopped being updated. But some part of her never gave up. Not really. The town of Elkhorn had moved on, like towns do, but she remained fixed in that one moment. October 11th, 1999, the night her son Miles and 5 of his basketball teammates vanished into thin air. Now, it was spring in Oregon, and the rain tapped steadily against her weather-worn porch as she opened the front gate to check the mailbox. Inside, tucked between bills and a real estate flyer, was a brown, unmarked package. No return address, no stamps. Just her name, Mrs. Eloise Roan, written in black letters across the top with a heavy black marker. She felt her heart flutter in a way it hadn't in years. Inside the house, the kettle whistled, ignored. She sat at the dining table with the box in front of her like it was a bomb. Her hand shook as she broke the seal. Inside, beneath layers of crumpled newspaper, was something that made her breath catch. A high-top basketball sneaker, worn, size 11, with a small tear near the toe. But what made her gasp wasn't the shoe itself. It was the name etched faintly on the inside tongue, Miles R. It was his. There was dried, dark brown staining the laces. Blood? Her stomach turned. A notebook, wrapped in a thin plastic sleeve. She fumbled it open, recognizing the handwriting before she even read the name. It was unmistakably her son's, the same loops and slants he used to scribble in his journals as a boy. The first page read, "If you're reading this, it means you found something they missed. We never left Oregon. We were taken. Hunted." Eloise felt the room tilt. She clutched the notebook to her chest, breath shallow, heart thudding. She flipped through the pages. Some were smudged, others torn, but each entry told the same chilling story. They hadn't crashed. They hadn't run away. They were being hunted. Her son, her baby, had survived longer than anyone thought. Tears streamed down her face, but her hands were steady now. After all this time, someone had kept his memory alive. Someone knew something. She picked up the phone, not to call the police, not yet. She called her sister in Portland. That night, Eloise didn't sleep. She reread the journal 3 times. Miles had written in code, names shortened, locations vague. But one thing was clear. He believed they were still in Oregon. The phrase, Vortex Rock, came up repeatedly. It sounded familiar. She remembered a story from when she was young, a place in the woods north of town where compasses spun and hikers got disoriented. "Don't go near the vortex," the old man at the diner used to say. She pulled out the old topographic maps from the drawer, the same ones she had used for years during the endless searches. Her finger traced the ridge lines and dense forest trails. Something in her gut shifted. This wasn't over. Eloise knew that if she had the journal, someone had placed that package on her doorstep. Someone who had waited 23 years to reach out. But why now? And why her? In the final pages of the journal, the entries became hurried, frantic. The handwriting jittered, sentences incomplete. The last full entry read, "We moved east. Emery saw them first. They're not like before. They don't hunt for sport anymore. They hunt for silence." That line haunted her. She didn't know what it meant, but she knew enough to feel the urgency. She spent the next day scanning every local newspaper archive she could find. Most of the coverage had been archived digitally, but there was little after 2004. The story had been buried, forgotten. The boys, including Miles, were declared legally deceased in 2008. But she had never accepted it, not once. She dug out the old case file copies from the attic, stacked in dusty boxes marked Miles. There were timelines, newspaper clippings, even photos from the vigil. And something else, one of the last photos taken of the team. In the corner, standing far from the group, was a man Eloise didn't recognize. Tall, bearded, watching. Her hands trembled again, but this time from clarity. She scanned the photo and uploaded it to a forum for missing persons investigators. Maybe someone would recognize him. Maybe someone else had seen his face. By the third day, a user from Idaho replied, "I've seen that guy." Back in, Eloise wrote down the name, Pinamore. She checked the map again. It wasn't far from the old hiking routes the boys used to train on. Could it be? Could he have taken them there? That night, as the wind howled through the trees outside her house, Eloise packed a bag. She put the journal, the shoe, the map, and her old flashlight inside. She didn't know what she would find, but she was going. For miles, for truth. 2 days after receiving the package, Eloise stood alone in the cluttered office of an old friend, Chuck Delaney, a retired sheriff who still had access to some of the local archives. His office, stacked with yellowing folders and dusty VHS tapes, hadn't changed in 20 years. Chuck hadn't either, save for the deeper creases around his eyes and the more permanent stiffness in his gait. "You're really back in this?" he asked, not unkindly, but with the exhausted skepticism of someone who'd spent years chasing phantoms. Eloise nodded, placing Miles's journal gently on the desk. "I need everything you have from the area around Vortex Ridge, and any traffic footage, anything weird from October 1999. Chuck sighed, but after a long look at her, he started pulling boxes. They combed through hours of grainy footage, mostly useless. But then, near dawn, in a bin labeled simply Elkhorn West, they found a worn tape marked with the date October 11, 1999. Chuck slid it into an old VCR, and the static crackled to life. The timestamp flickered, 10:56 p.m. The view was fixed from a high corner outside a gas station long since abandoned. At first just trees, empty road, then headlights. A dark vehicle familiar in silhouette, the team's van. It didn't turn toward Elkhorn as it should have. Instead it paused at the junction, idled for 20 seconds, then turned sharply west toward the forest, toward a side road nearly swallowed by trees, marked only with a hand-painted sign. Eloise's breath caught. "That road was never searched," Chuck muttered, leaning forward. "Too far outside the perimeter. Hell, I forgot it existed." Eloise stared at the frozen frame, a chill sliding down her spine. They hadn't gotten lost. They had been directed. She took a photo of the screen with her phone and left, her hands shaking only slightly. On her way home, she couldn't stop staring at the image, the road, the trees, the deliberate turn. She needed to know who might have led them there. That evening she opened the dusty yearbook stored in the attic, one for every graduating class since the late 80s. She flipped past the team photo of '99, the last one taken before the disappearance. There was Coach Clara Hewitt, smiling stiffly, her eyes unreadable. She had been young then, barely 30, new to the school but beloved by the team. Eloise remembered how she used to speak in lofty metaphors about character, purity, sacrifice. At the time it had sounded inspiring. Now it felt cultish. A thought struck Eloise like a thunderbolt. She ran to her office and powered up the computer. After digging through state employment records and social directories, she found it, an old church registry from 1993. Clara Hewitt's name appeared beside an organization, West Chapter. The name didn't register at first, but as she clicked deeper, she found whispers, forum threads, scanned clippings, faded photos. Ordinary Puritatis wasn't a church. It was a cloistered, off-grid sect. No website, no current address, just a scattered trail of disappearances, rumors, and cryptic slogans like, "The soul must be cut from noise to sing." Chillingly, several of the sect's gatherings had been held near Vortex Ridge. Eloise's breath quickened. She searched deeper. A newspaper article from 1992 in a small California town referenced a teen boy missing after a spiritual retreat hosted by the same group. In the margin, someone had scanned sermon transcript, Clara's name listed as participant and guide. The document described a ceremony for the extraction of corrupt influence and included references to wilderness isolation, physical trials, and, disturbingly, silencing ritual noise. Eloise felt physically ill. She sat back, overwhelmed, and stared at the ceiling. Could this really be who Miles's coach had been? Had she led those boys not to safety after the game, but directly into some twisted rite of passage? She grabbed Miles' journal again. One line near the middle stood out now. Coach tried to make us drink something. Jordan said it burned. Travis threw it back at her, and that's when she stopped smiling. Eloise's hands trembled. Her son had been there, had seen Clara break or reveal herself. The next page included another cryptic mention. Emery whispered, "Ordinem" in his sleep. He used to laugh when he said it. Now he just cries. Eloise's eyes widened. Emery Chen, the quietest one. He had a scholarship offer pending at the town. She remembered his mother, desperate and broken at the town hall meetings. Emery had always looked up to Clara. Had he followed her willingly? Had he led the others into it? She didn't know. Not yet, but it was a thread. She called Chuck again. Did Clara ever live near the ridge? He paused. No, but her brother had a cabin up there. Why? Eloise's blood ran cold. Because I think that's where they went, and I think she led them. Chuck swore under his breath. Jesus, Eloise, you realize if this is true, you're poking at something buried on purpose. Then I'm going to dig, she said, voice calm, because Miles didn't bury himself. The next morning, Eloise packed a new map, highlighted the ridge area, and drove north. She parked where the old road from the tape began, now little more than a scar of the undergrowth. The wind whispered through the trees, as if warning her back, but she stepped forward. The forest swallowed her. The forest air was heavier than Eloise remembered from her youth, clinging to her skin like a wet sheet as she pushed through the underbrush along the faded path seen in the footage. The trees here seemed older, twisted, darker, as if they had grown around secrets no one dared to speak of. Her boots crunched over wet leaves and broken twigs, and somewhere in the distance a bird cried once, and then fell silent. After 2 hours of hiking and no sign of a cabin, she sat on a moss-covered rock and pulled out Miles's journal again, flipping through to the page that had grown more familiar by the hour, the rough hand-drawn map of something he called Vortex Rock. The sketch was amateur but purposeful, landmarks noted in abbreviated initials, one with a star labeled HP and another simply The Drop. She didn't yet know what H meant, but the center of the map, the place all paths curved toward, was marked with a crude spiral. Vortex Rock. She remembered the stories now, local legends whispered in the diner when she was a girl. It was a spot in the ridge that caused compasses to spin, dogs to whimper, hikers to lose time. No one ever proved anything, but 2 teenagers vanished there in 1974, a hunter in 1983, a park ranger in 1987. It was the kind of place you joked about but never entered. She now believed Miles had been there. Maybe he had died there. Maybe he had escaped from there, and maybe, just maybe, something darker had remained behind. She took out her portable tape recorder, one of the few tools Chuck had insisted she bring, alongside a small parabolic mic. "You'll want to document everything," he'd said. Even the silence. Back in town, Chuck was digging too. He had returned to the archive room that evening, unable to shake what Eloise had shown him. He pulled another unmarked box from the lower shelf, dated 2001, labeled Elkhorn High Custodial Storage. It's silent, mostly junk, torn textbooks, an old team jersey, a broken trophy base. But at the bottom, wrapped in yellowed newspaper, was a black cassette tape. No label. Chuck narrowed his eyes. He hadn't seen a tape like that in years. He popped it into the scratch of something brushing the mic. Silence. Then a voice. A boy. Desperate. Inside. Then a voice. A boy. A pause. Breathing. Then a whisper, barely audible. "We got separated. Emery's gone. Keith says we're near the stone, but the signal's all—" Then a sudden scream in the background. Another voice shouting, "Run!" Then something that didn't sound human. A growl? Chuck paused the tape, his hand trembling. He rewound, listened again, slower. This time he caught the last sentence more clearly. "He's hunting us. He sees us even when we hide. Please, someone tell my mom. We didn't mean to go off trail. We didn't mean to—" The tape clicked off. Chuck sat frozen, then immediately dialed Eloise's number. It went to voicemail. She was still in the woods. He left a message. "Call me the second you get this. I found something." You were right, Eloise. You were right about all of it. Back in the ridge, Eloise stood at the edge of a dry creek bed, cross-checking Miles' map with her own GPS. A stone formation jutted out from the slope ahead, jagged, spiral-shaped, partially buried under brush. Her heart pounded. She had found it. Vortex Rock. As she stepped closer, her compass spun wildly. The air grew still. Her breath seemed louder than it should have. She scanned the area and noticed something odd. Burn marks on a tree trunk. Not from lightning. They were patterned, circular, ritualistic. She pulled out her phone and began taking pictures when her foot caught on something half-burned deeply in the soil. She knelt and cleared the leaves. It was plastic, old, scratched. A Walkman. Her chest tightened. She turned it over and found Miles' initials etched on the back with what looked like a safety pin. MR99. The battery was corroded, the tape inside partially melted. But it was real. She was standing where he had stood, maybe even where he had hidden. She placed the recorder in her pack and looked around. There were carvings in a nearby stone, more initials, faint from erosion. She touched the letters as if to confirm they were real. Something shifted behind her. A breeze, or maybe just her imagination. She turned fast, flashlight raised. Nothing. The forest remained silent, but her instincts screamed otherwise. She was not alone. She didn't know if it was human, animal, or something else, but she knew when she was being watched. She didn't run. She didn't call out. She backed slowly toward the slope and made her way down, determined to circle back and leave markers for Chuck to find. The sun was dipping behind the trees now, casting long shadows that looked too much like reaching hands. She had proof now, something tangible to bring back. The tape, the Walkman, the markings, but it wasn't enough. She needed the truth. She needed to know what had taken them. She checked her map again, noting a trail just northeast of the rock, marked Hey P in Miles' journal. She would go there next, but first she had to make it back without drawing attention to herself. As she started down the slope, her phone buzzed once. No service, but a notification had loaded anyway, a voicemail from Chuck. She pressed play. His voice was urgent. "Eloise, the tape. It's Travis. He's talking about something, hunting them, and he mentions the stone. You need to be careful. That place, Vortex, it's more than a landmark. Call me back the moment you—" The message cut off. The phone buzzed again. One new voicemail. No caller ID. Eloise didn't return to her car that night. Instead, she camped halfway down the ridge with her back against a stone ledge, eyes open, flashlight in hand, and the recorder still running, capturing the silence or whatever might move through it. Her phone battery died by midnight, but she had already memorized Chuck's final words, particularly the tone in his voice. Part discovery, part fear. At dawn, she moved fast, retracing the last segment of Miles' map toward the point labeled Chuck Point. The forest changed subtly here. Trees stood straighter, more intentional, as if they had once been cleared and allowed to grow back in patterns. She followed a broken path of cracked stones, remnants of old pavement, until she reached a clearing shrouded in moss and ivy. There, half sunken into the earth, stood the skeleton of a long-abandoned building. A training lodge or perhaps a ranger station once, but the paint had peeled away to reveal scorched wood, and the windows gaped like hollow eyes. As she stepped inside, her boot hit something hard under the dirt-covered floorboards. Kneeling, she swept aside debris to reveal rusted hinges and a chain handle. A trap door. She hesitated only a moment, then pulled. It groaned open to a short flight of steps, descending into darkness. The air that rose up was fetid, stale, thick with the scent of rot and iron. She turned on her flashlight and moved downward. The basement was wide and low-ceilinged, its walls reinforced with stone and lined with long-forgotten supplies. Lanterns, crates, a rusted water heater, but in the far corner, obscured beneath a canvas tarp, was something else. Eloise peeled it back slowly. Her scream caught in her throat. It was the van. The Elkhorn Valley team van. The school's blue and white logo, though faded, was still visible on the side panel. Its windshield was cracked, the front right tire deflated, and there were gashes along the doors, as if something had tried to claw its way out. Inside, there were makeshift restraints bolted into the seat frames, duct-taped remnants, metal clasps, ropes hardened with age. Beneath the driver's seat lay a backpack marked with Keith's son's initials. She opened it. A moldy uniform, a half-used journal, and an inhaler still labeled with a pharmacy sticker dated October 3, 1999. Eloise backed away, hands trembling, snapping photos with a second photo or tattoo on a collar that she had found it, the place they were held, maybe where they were last alive. She scoured the basement further and found what looked like a crude cot built from crates and blankets in one corner, along with a pile of cracked Polaroids. In them, the boys were visibly thinner, visibly afraid. One showed Emery sitting on the floor with a bandage on his forehead. Another showed Travis and Miles huddled together, eyes turned toward the unseen photographer. The final photo showed Coach Hewitt herself, sitting stiffly with arms folded, her expression blank, but her lip bruised. Eloise's breath hitched. Had she been a prisoner too? Or was it guilt, resistance? She didn't know. The last thing she found in the basement was buried under a pile of stone and sand near the wall. It was a box. Small. Locked. She pried it open with a crowbar from the storage rack. Inside was a journal, leather-bound and written in neat script. It wasn't Miles. It belonged to someone else, Clara Hewitt. The entries spanned 3 months, in late 1999, and began rational, professional, even optimistic. The boys are adjusting, some faster than others. Emery leads well, but they shifted over time. Keith won't stop crying. I told them this is a rite, a passage, that the noise must be stripped away. Travis tried to run. I locked the trap door for the night. Then later, Roman comes less now, says I've grown weak. He says they're not worthy. And finally, I don't believe anymore. The children are not better, they are broken. This is not purification, this is cruelty. Eloise sat back, stunned. Clara had turned, or tried to, but it wasn't enough. The next day, Chuck arrived with a small forensics team from Portland, coordinated quietly to avoid media. Eloise led them to the basement. Their reactions were immediate, shock, then urgency. Photos were taken, samples bagged. Evidence secured. It took only an hour to confirm the van's VIN. The county issued a press embargo, but internally, the case reopened. And then came the bones. During excavation of the basement wall, one of the crew uncovered a narrow tunnel reinforced with rotted planks. Inside, they found a skeletal figure slumped against the stone. It had been there for years. Initial assumptions suggested one of the missing boys, but when dental records returned, the results shocked everyone. The remains didn't match any known victim. The person had been an adult male, mid-40s, with no record in the missing persons database. And strangest of all, embedded in the ribcage was a ceremonial dagger engraved with the ordinum sigil. The stab wound had been deep, precise, and there were signs of post-mortem ritual burning on the hands and feet. The local coroner, disturbed, muttered. Chuck ordered DNA cross-checks with surrounding counties, but Eloise already knew they had found one of Roman's own. Maybe a rival, maybe a follower, maybe someone who tried to leave. Either way, it proved something darker than abduction. This was ideology, worship, devotion. Eloise stepped outside the lodge, staring at the forest that now seemed somehow heavier, older, aware. She clutched Miles' journal tightly. It had warned her. We were taken. We were hunted. But by whom? And to what end? She turned to Chuck. Need to find the others. If they were kept here, someone else might have escaped. We still haven't found Jim, or Emery, or Darnell. Chuck nodded, grim. And whoever did this might not be done yet. That night, Eloise sat alone in the lodge's main room, flipping through the second notebook they had recovered from under Keith's cot. Most of it was blank, but in the center, scrawled in a jagged hand, was a single phrase repeated 3 times. He walks between the pines. He walks between the pines. He walks between... The fire crackled low as Eloise sat beside the temporary forensic tent, set up outside the abandoned lodge. Her hands wrapped around a tin cup of lukewarm coffee. The night air was sharp, scented with pine sap and faint decay, and though the team inside the basement had retired for the evening, her thoughts refused to settle. She kept replaying the phrase over and over again, "He walks between the pines," a mantra scrawled in Keith's hand that seemed to echo through the trees around her. The investigators had taken the notebooks, the Polaroids, even Clara Hewitt's journal, and promised to analyze every detail. But Eloise needed something more immediate, more human. Something alive, She returned to Elkhorn the following morning, her boots still stained from the earth of that cursed lodge, and parked at the town square. Some avoided her gaze, others offered polite nods, whispers following her like shadows. She didn't care. At the library's microfilm room, she requested every piece of footage recorded during the days following the disappearances, most of it donated by local news crews or pulled from old VHS tapes dropped off by residents over the years. One tape caught her attention. It had been filed under Unverify Eyewitness, dated November 1999. On the screen, a reporter stood in front of a shuttered convenience store in Ashwood, 30 miles north of Elkhorn, interviewing a gaunt man with wild eyes and fingerless gloves. "I saw him," he mumbled, clutching a worn-out photo and shaking hands. "The kid with the red jacket. He came running out the trees. He screamed, 'Don't come back! Don't look!' He looked straight at me and vanished again." Eloise froze. The photo he held up was grainy, but unmistakable. It was Miles. The jacket, the face, the scar above the eyebrow. The man had seen him, alive. Weeks after the van vanished, she traced the man's name from the video's credits. Wade Carter, once a park ranger, now homeless. Chuck confirmed he'd been picked up a few times over the years for loitering, mostly in Deschutes County. With some pressure, they tracked him down to a shelter on the outskirts of Portland. Eloise made the drive herself. The shelter was cramped, warm, and smelled of disinfectant and old socks. Wade sat in the corner by the radiator, wrapped in 3 coats and humming to himself. When Eloise approached, he looked up slowly, recognition dawning in his weary eyes. "You're the boy's mother," he said, nodded. Eloise nodded. "Miles, you saw him, didn't you?" Wade, he ran out of the trees like a deer, thin, wild-eyed, screaming. "I tried to follow, but he was gone before I stood up, and behind him, I swear to God, ma'am," the trees moved. Ella Henrietta handed him the same photo from the video. "Are you sure it was him?" Wade tapped the image with a crooked finger. "I never forget a face that begs." She thanked him, left some cash with the staff, and returned to her car with tears brimming in her eyes. If Miles had made it out once, maybe he'd done it again. Maybe he was still trying. Back at Chuck's office, more evidence was being processed. One of the techs discovered a locked storage box hidden beneath the lodge's attic crawlspace, dusty and half-crushed under beams. Inside were old film reels and several unmarked VHS tapes. One of them had been labeled simply "Offer." They digitized it, and the footage that played chilled every person in the room. The tape began with grainy footage of the stone altar Eloise had found etched into Miles's map. 4 boys, faces gaunt, eyes vacant, and Emery was not present. The boys wore plain garments, white tunics stained with mud and blood. A circle of torches surrounded the altar, their flickering light illuminating a rough-hewn stone table in the center. Standing nearby was a tall man, face obscured by a carved wooden mask resembling a stag. His voice, distorted through the tape, chanted words in Latin. Then, entering from the left side of the screen, Clara Hewitt. She moved slowly, mechanically, her expression hollow. Her arms were tied behind her back with rope, though no one held her. She approached the altar and paused. The masked figure placed a hand on her shoulder and whispered something into her ear. She shook her head once, violently, but he gripped her tighter. The camera zoomed slightly. Clara was crying. The ritual began. The boys were made to kneel. One by one, they were asked to recite what sounded like an oath. Caleb hesitated and was struck across the mouth with a leather strap. Emery looked over his shoulder, straight into the camera, and mouthed something impossible to hear. Possibly, "Help us." Then the tape glitched. When it resumed, Clara was lying beside the altar, unmoving. The masked man now held something high, a knife, possibly the same ceremonial dagger found with the skeleton. The screen flickered again. Static overtook the image. The tape ended. Everyone in the room sat silent for several moments. Chuck finally spoke. Eloise stood rigid, fists clenched. "They made her do it, or tried to. That man Roman, it was him behind the mask." Chuck nodded. "It fits, the posture, the hands, and the Latin Puritatis rites." Eloise stared at the frozen final frame of the tape. Clara collapsed, the boys terrified, the firelight dancing like specters across stone. Her mind raced. The footage had a timestamp, November 3, 1999, nearly a month after the boys vanished. They had survived. They had endured, and someone had recorded it like it was sacred theater. She demanded the other tapes be reviewed immediately. If one existed, there might be more. Evidence, truth, maybe even a lead on where Miles had gone. Chuck placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "We'll find them. We'll find whoever's responsible, but there's something you need to know. The ritual site, someone's been back recently. We found fresh footprints. Someone's watching again." Eloise didn't flinch. "Been there afraid." She turned back to the screen, rewound the tape, and paused at the moment Emery looked directly into the camera. His eyes pleaded silently. Somewhere out there, at least one of them had been left behind, or perhaps never truly escaped. The day after the tape surfaced, Eloise sat in the evidence review room. The image of Emery Chen staring directly into the camera still burned into her thoughts. That moment, his lips forming silent words, the desperation in his eyes, had created a fracture in the numb acceptance the world had built around the disappearance of those 6 boys. Now it wasn't just about uncovering the truth. It was about rescuing whatever remained of them, especially Emery, who had not only survived, but had possibly been left behind, forced to play witness in a nightmare no child should endure. Chuck's team had already sent screenshots from the VHS video to law enforcement databases nationwide, cross-referencing admissions and juvenile centers. Less than 24 hours later, they got a hit. In 2007, a boy had been admitted to a psychiatric facility in Twin Falls, Idaho, under the alias Eli Channer. He had been found wandering the Snake River Trail alone, barefoot, wearing clothes several sizes too large, and mumbling about the eyes in the pine and the stone with teeth. He had no ID, no memory beyond vague fragments about the ritual and someone named Miles. The intake nurse, unsettled but intrigued, had written a note in his file. "May be delusional or survivor of cult-based trauma, speaks occasionally in archaic phrasing, draws repeated symbols, spirals, masks, fire pits." But the most chilling detail was in the sketchbook they found in his pocket. On one of the pages he had drawn 6 stick figures around a large boulder etched with a spiral. Beside them he had written in childish print, "We were chosen. I was spared." When authorities tried to question him, he would shut down. When they attempted psychological evaluation, he grew increasingly agitated. After 2 weeks, he escaped the facility, leaving behind a single sentence scratched into the mirror in the patient bathroom. "He's still watching." DNA pulled from a hair sample finally confirmed what Eloise had begun to suspect. Eli Channer was Emery Chan. The match was indisputable, but now the question remained, where had he gone since, and why had he remained silent all these years? Chuck tracked a few sightings in Boise between 2008 and 2011, including one at a camping supply store where a clerk remembered a quiet Asian man with a stare like a wild thing. After that, Emery vanished again. Meanwhile, Eloise continued digging through the journals and tape archives until she stumbled on a set of teacher employment records from the late 90s. That's when she found him. The man in the mask, the one who whispered to Clara Hewitt before pressing the blade into the air. His name had appeared only once, in a background staff listing from 1998 for substitute gym teachers. Randall Roman. Her hands went cold. She remembered him vaguely, tall, stern, strange. He had lasted only a few weeks before being removed for disciplinary mass conducting during after-school training. No charges had ever been filed, no further records existed in the school systems, but Eloise wasn't deterred. She enlisted the help of a private archivist in Eugene who specialized in sealed educational personnel files. It cost her 2 weeks' worth of groceries, but she got what she needed. Roman had once been a staff trainer at a summer boys camp in Montana during the early 90s, Camp Astrum, which had been shuttered after 3 teenage boys went missing. The report was thin, but telling. Camp counselor R. Roman dismissed prior to investigation. No conclusive evidence found. The camp's emblem? A stag head within a spiral. Eloise's breath hitched as she laid that symbol beside one of Emery's drawings. It was identical. She called Chuck. He didn't just lead a ritual, he built it. This wasn't an accident. Roman has done this before. Chuck agreed, his tone heavy. We've been looking at this like a failed disappearance. It's not. It's a series of orchestrated abductions hidden within institutions no one thinks to investigate. Together they constructed a timeline, and what emerged was a horrifying portrait. Ruman had moved through schools, camps, and churches across 4 states, always leaving just before scandal surfaced, always working with at-risk youth or athletic programs. Wherever he went, rumors followed of strange discipline practices, wilderness retreats, and boys who returned quieter, thinner, and fearful of the dark. The deeper they searched, the more patterns emerged. In 1996, a church in Crescent City reported a missing altar boy. In 1994, 2 teens vanished from a boot camp in Colorado Springs. In each case, a mentor figure was listed in attendance records, never arrested, never even questioned. And in every photograph from those times, the same man stood in the background, often blurry, often partially obscured, but always watching. Chuck contacted the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit. The response was immediate. "We've been trying to connect these for years. If you've got a name and confirmed footage, this might be the break we need." Eloise handed them everything: Miles' journal, the VHS tape, Clara's confessional entries. But something gnawed at her. It wasn't enough to expose him. They had to find him. Before he vanished again. Then came another twist. A wilderness photographer hiking near the Idaho border turned in an old camera memory card she'd found in a destroyed backpack lodged beneath a rock slide. Most of the data was corrupted, but one photo remained. It showed a cabin, ramshackle, distant, tucked between pine trees, and in the far right corner of the frame, barely visible, stood a figure in a long coat, wearing what looked like a carved wooden mask. Behind him, a boy crouched by the fire, hair long, face obscured by shadows. When the image was enhanced, facial recognition software provided a low-confidence match: Miles Roan. Eloise stared at the image for what felt like an hour. He had survived. Roman hadn't killed him. Not yet. Chuck circled the map coordinates printed in the photo's metadata. The area was dense, uninhabited for miles, no known structures. "He's hiding in the cracks of the map," Chuck muttered, "but if we start now, we might get there before the next storm cuts it off." Eloise nodded slowly. "I'm going. I don't care what it takes. If Miles is there," Chuck finished for her. "We bring him home?" 2 days after receiving the photo of the masked man, beside a shadowed figure crouching near a fire, Eloise stood in the records room of St. Augustine Hospital, a long-adjunct rehabilitation center in rural Idaho. She had driven through the night, unable to sleep, fueled only by black coffee and desperation. The hospital had been shut down in 2011 due to funding issues and multiple negligence complaints, but before it closed, it had been a last resort facility for patients who fell through the cracks, homeless, unidentifiable, untraceable. And it was here that the next piece of the puzzle emerged. The receptionist at the local clinic remembered Eloise from her last visit, the one to track down Emery's admission under the alias Eloise Channer. This time, however, Eloise wasn't asking about Emery. She had a new name. "Jordan Reyes," she said. The receptionist raised an eyebrow. That name was never listed officially, but she paused, typing into the old database. "Eth did have a patient come in 2009. No ID, claimed his name was J.R. Sometimes he said Jared, sometimes Julian, sometimes just J. Never consistent. Lost time. Had memory gaps. He kept saying the same thing over and over." Eloise leaned in. "What did he say?" the woman whispered, as if it might summon something. "He said row, row," watching up again. "Roman?" Eloise's hands trembled slightly. "Is there anyone still around who worked with him?" The woman tapped her pen against the desk. "There's a retired nurse, Vivian Mallory. She kept some of the case notes for legal reasons. She might remember him. She lives out by Red Hill." Eloise drove straight there, her knuckles white against the steering wheel. Vivian Mallory answered the door with cautious eyes and a sharp voice, but once she heard Jordan's name, her demeanor shifted. She invited Eloise in and poured her a cup of peppermint tea. "I remember the boy," Vivian said, settling into a creaking armchair. "He was 16 when they brought him in, thin as paper, skin like a bruise. He never looked anyone in the eye, kept repeating that one word, row." When we tried to ask what it meant, he'd curl up and start humming, rocking like he was somewhere else entirely. Eloise showed her a photograph of Jordan from the old team picture. Vivian's eyes filled with tears. "That's him. Oh my God, that's really him." She retrieved a worn notebook from her filing cabinet, labeled Patient Jr. 2009. The entries were fragmented, but one stood out. Nightmares frequent, refers to a stone circle, mentions vortex. The fire. Eloise clutched the book to her chest. "Where did he go?" Vivian shook her head. "He escaped after 6 weeks. We think someone helped him. There was no sign of forced exit, just a note on his bed. Back to the pines." Eloise drove back toward the Vortex Rock region, coordinating with Chuck's search team, now scouring the region identified from the metadata of the photo. Using satellite overlays and old ranger maps, they pinpointed a potential location northwest of the spiral altar. It was an outcrop of ridges veined with narrow cave systems, places once explored for mining in the 1930s, later abandoned due to instability. No trails, no park signs, just forgotten geography. She led the way through thick brush, every sound amplified, every shadow suspect. The forest here wasn't just dense, it felt possessed. After 5 hours of climbing and 3 minor landslides, they found a cave mouth half hidden beneath a collapsed pine tree, its roots stretched like fingers across stone. Chuck checked for airflow, still warm, still active. They entered slowly, flashlights raised. The passage twisted sharply downward, then widened into a dome-shaped chamber with natural columns and blackened walls. And on those walls, words, names, carved by hand. 6 names, each in black letters. Miles, Travis, Caleb, Jordan, Keith, Emery. Beneath them, in smaller, more frantic scratches, a single sentence repeated 3 times. "If Mom comes, they'll find her too. If Mom comes, they'll find her too. If Mom comes..." Eloise reached out, brushing her fingers across Miles's name. The grooves were deep, recent. "He was here," she whispered. Chuck studied the chamber, his flashlight scanning upward. "That's not just a warning, that's a trap. Whoever wrote that knew someone would come." In the center of the cave, partially buried beneath loose rock, they found a rusted thermos, a torn piece of cloth, and a cassette recorder caked in grime. They collected everything and retreated slowly, marking their route with chalk and GPS as they went. Back at base, the audio was cleaned and restored. The tape was damaged, but portions survived. The voice was male, young, strained by fatigue and fear. "This is Jordan. If anyone hears this..." "I made it to the cave. The others, some left, some were taken. I don't remember everything, but I remember Roe. He comes at night. He whispers through the trees. If you're here, don't call for help, just leave. Tell my mom I tried." Eloise wept silently as the tape played. He had been there. They had all been there, and someone had been watching them, guiding them, maybe even documenting them. That cave was more than a hideout. It was a confessional, a tomb, a shrine. She turned to Chuck, determination in her eyes. "We're close now. If Jordan survived this long, maybe Miles did too. Maybe they both did. We just have to keep digging." Chuck nodded slowly. "Then we start where the trail leads from this cave." He held up a fragment of map found in the thermos. It showed a winding path marked only by one word scribbled in red ink. Eloise stared at it, her voice a whisper. "Then that's where we go." As Chuck traced the faint red ink path labeled EREL from the cave wall to a nearby judge line obscured on modern maps, Eloise paced the camp perimeter, mind spiraling with fragments of everything they'd uncovered. Names carved into stone, desperate cassette messages, cryptic journal entries, and whispers of Emery's betrayal. Or was it sacrifice? When the call came through from Portland Forensics, her pulse jumped. The thermos found in the cave had yielded more than just the audio. Wrapped inside a moldy shirt fragment, pressed between folded wax paper, was a notebook, water-damaged, but still legible. It had belonged to Keith's son. Eloise held her breath as the tech read one of the translated passages aloud. "Day unknown. I think Emery made a deal. He talks to Roman when the rest of us sleep, says it's the only way we make it out. I don't know if he believes that, or if he wants to..." The air in the tent grew colder as silence followed. Chuck rubbed his temple and muttered, if Emery thought infiltrating Roman's inner circle would save the others, maybe he volunteered. But what if he was taken in? Another line from Keith's journal added more weight. We see Eloy less now. He eats alone. Sometimes he watches us like he doesn't recognize our faces. I think he's forgetting us to remember him. Eloise clenched the notebook, voice steady. Then he didn't forget. He left this behind, to be found. With the cave mapped and the last journal translated, the team followed the ridgeline north for 3 miles before stumbling upon what could only be described as a shack built from salvaged structures. Tin walls, hand-carved wooden supports, a stone chimney with black scars. The door was padlocked, but Chuck broke it open with a crowbar. Inside was not what they expected. This wasn't a hideout, it was a command center. Along the back wall hung a massive map, hand-drawn, with layers of trails, cave systems, and marked coordinates. Each was tagged with a date, some from decades ago, some terrifyingly recent. Most were labeled with codes like R1, R2, C3, but a few bore names. One near the bottom read, TH, incomplete. Another read CH, failed, and near the top, written in red ink with a line connecting multiple points, was MR, active. Eloise's knees weakened. Miles was still a target, or worse, still considered part of an ongoing ritual. Beside the map sat a filing cabinet. Rusted, swollen from damp, it took 2 crowbars to wrench open. Inside were folders, case files, possibly stolen records, each with a photograph clipped to the front. Children, teenagers, all boys, all missing. Chuck counted over 30. These aren't just victims, he said grimly. These were candidates. Near the window stood a rotting writing desk with an open ledger. The entries were meticulous: times, weather conditions, supplies, patterns of travel, but what chilled them most were the headings atop each page. Silent, the rhetoric matched exactly what Clara Hewitt had written in her personal journal recovered from the lodge. But this was deeper, structured, premeditated. Roman hadn't just enacted a ritual, he had built a doctrine. Eloise turned to the final page. It was blank, except for a single sentence in thick, uneven strokes. If one breaks the silence, they all hear. She stared at the sentence, then whispered, Miles wrote that in his journal. Chuck replied, then Roman read it, and he answered. A narrow trap door was found beneath a rug in the corner. Eloise's heart pounded as they descended into a crawlspace lined with animal bones, extinguished candles, and symbols carved in overlapping spirals. A makeshift shrine stood at the center, built from old basketball medals, fragments of shoes, and a shredded team jersey nailed to a beam. Number 4, the number Miles had worn, but what caught Eloise's eye was the mural behind it, painted in ash and blood, a forest with eyes in the trees, and a boy standing alone at the center, surrounded by fire. She turned away, nauseated, whispering, He's trying to become legend, to make them part of the myth. Chuck's voice was low. No, he's trying to make them forget they were ever real. Outside the shack, the light began to fade, the clouds thickening like a closing curtain. Eloise scanned the perimeter again, instincts honed from days of pursuit, screaming that something, or someone, was nearby. And then she saw it. Nailed to a tree 20 feet from the back of the shack was a Polaroid, flapping gently in the breeze. She approached and froze. It was Emery, not as a boy, as a man. Standing beside Roman, neither smiling, both staring straight into the lens. On the back of the photo, written in Miles's scrawl, he let him live, but at what cost? The wind howled through the trees outside the cholla like a living thing, sweeping past the cracked wood and flapping the corners of the map that hung nailed to the wall. Chuck stood at the center of the room, eyes darting between the marked coordinates, trying to decode the pattern. Eloise sat on the floor with the Polaroid in her hand, staring into Emery's face. Older, but not lost. The caption Miles had written, he let him live, but at what cost, was not an accusation. It was a clue. He's alive, she whispered, mostly to herself. He's still trying to help. One location in particular on the map stood out, labeled A Tree-Assisted Simul Congregation. It was the only point marked with both a red circle and a symbol, a spiral surrounded by radiating lines. The same image carved on the altar stones, Chuck tapped it. "This is different. It's not a ritual site. It's a retreat. Maybe a hideout." They moved quickly. The terrain was brutal, slopes buried in snowmelt, trees collapsed across trails, animal scat fresh along the path, but they followed the marked route with GPS, weaving through thickets until they reached a hollowed ravine surrounded by cliff walls. From above it looked like nothing, but when Chuck's team descended by rope, they found it, tucked beneath an overhang, camouflaged with branches and mud, a dugout shelter. Inside was Emery Chin. Alive, barely. His hair was longer now, his cheeks hollow, bones showing through his torn clothing. He flinched when the flashlight hit his eyes and raised his arms weakly in defense until Eloise stepped forward and whispered, "Emery, it's me. It's Miles' mom." His body sagged in relief, as if the name alone broke some ancient spell. The medics rushed forward, but he held up a hand. "I'm okay," he croaked. "Just tired." Chuck knelt beside him, voice steady. "We thought you were dead." Emery gave a slow, fragile smile. "I was. Almost. But I couldn't leave. Not yet." "Why?" Eloise asked. "Because," Emery said, forcing himself to sit upright, "I made a promise. I told Miles I'd protect him." Eloise's heart jumped. "He's alive?" Emery nodded. "He's safe, but he wouldn't leave, not until it was all documented. Everything Ruman did, every ritual, every lie. Every name." Chuck looked stunned. "You mean?" "He's been watching this whole time." Emery nodded again, this time slower, recording, writing, building a file. "He wants the truth to come out." They carried Emery up the ridge carefully, and once he had been checked and stabilized, he drew a rough diagram of a cave system hidden 3 miles northeast. "It's sealed from the outside," he said. "We dug a tunnel through one of the collapsed mine shafts back in 2006. It's not on any map. Miles built it into a bunker. We called it the Vault." "That's where he is." The team set out before dawn. They passed deer bones, old snares, and broken compass readings that twisted their instruments into nonsense. But Emery guided them without error. He walked like a ghost, but with purpose, tracing memories instead of terrain. Near midday they reached a fissure in the mountainside, a narrow break hidden behind a thicket of blackberry brambles. The entrance was no more than a crawlspace, but after 30 feet it widened into a cavern with reinforced walls, steel shelves, a water filtration system powered by gravity, and stacks upon stacks of notebooks, tapes, photos, and carefully labeled evidence. And in the far corner, sitting at a desk made from old crates, hunched over a tape recorder, was Miles Roan. Eloise froze in the entrance, her breath stolen by the sight. His back was broader, his hair longer, streaked with gray despite his age, but the way he tilted his head, the way his hands moved across the page, it was him. "Miles," she said, her voice cracking. He didn't turn at first, then slowly he swiveled in the chair. His eyes met hers, sharp, searching, wondered. He blinked, as if unsure if what he saw was real. "Mom?" he whispered. Eloise ran to him, collapsing into his arms, holding him like she might vanish if she let go. Miles didn't cry. He just held her, silently, for minutes that felt like lifetimes. When she finally pulled back, he looked at Emery and nodded. "You kept your word." Emery smiled faintly. "Told you I would." Miles turned to Chuck. "I have proof. Everything. Not just Roman. The entire network. I copied every file from his ledgers, recorded every chant, every night. I even have video." He thought I was broken, hiding. But I was documenting. Chuck looked around, stunned by the magnitude of what surrounded them. "You built the case?" "I built the truth," Miles corrected. "So, they can't rewrite us as ghosts." Eloise clutched one of the notebooks. "Why didn't you come back?" His voice was quiet. "Because if I left, they'd vanish. The evidence, the memory, the meaning. And I needed to matter." We all did. As they began cataloging the materials, Miles moved carefully, explaining each item's context, timeline, source. He showed them the footage he had captured, nights when Roman returned to the woods, chanting alone, sometimes with others, sometimes dragging someone new. There were faces on those tapes, some alive, some lost. But there was no denying the scale. Miles had turned pain into archive, memory into testimony. Emery rested against the wall, watching quietly. When Eloise asked how he had survived, he simply said, "I never stopped listening. Not to them, not to him." We became each other's echoes. Outside, the sun began to dip below the ridgeline, casting golden light through the cracked stone. For the first time in decades, hope touched the forest floor, but just as they were preparing to move the evidence, a low chirp came from Chuck's radio. A warning. Movement detected near the outer perimeter. Someone else was out there, watching. The forest gave way to the horizon for the first time in decades as the last box of evidence was loaded into the unmarked federal van and sealed with red tape. Each page, photo, taped, and recording meticulously logged and cross-referenced out the desk file, now known nationwide as Operation Echo Pines. Emery stood at the edge of the ridge, his hands in his coat pockets, watching the treetops shiver in the early morning light, while Miles helped Chuck and the others carry the final crates down the slope, his movements stiff but precise, each step forward a declaration that the years had not broken him. Eloise followed behind, her fingers lightly tracing the carvings on the cave wall one last time, 6 names etched into stone, no longer forgotten, now immortalized in the narrative they fought to reclaim. When the hearings began, the courtroom was packed with press, survivors' families, former classmates, and investigators from multiple agencies who had followed the trail since the first tape was uncovered. Miles, now clean-shaven, hair cut short, and wearing the only suit he owned, stepped up to the witness stand and laid out the sequence of events with clarity and resolve. His voice never wavered. He described the night they disappeared, the manipulation, the psychological conditioning, the rituals, the escape, and the years of watching, documenting, hiding in plain sight, while building a case that would bring not only awareness, but accountability. Emery followed him, less poised but no less powerful, his hands shaking as he described his internal war between survival and guilt, between pretending and protecting. When Jordan Reyes was found through hospital records and flown in from a recovery facility in Arizona, his testimony sealed the narrative. Though his memories were fractured, his account of the stone altar, the chanting, the fear, and the man in the mask, Ruman, matched exactly with Miles's footage and Keith's son's final entries. The prosecution laid out the timeline, supported by evidence spanning over 2 decades. Roman had created a network of manipulation disguised as mentorship, using fringe wilderness groups and failed youth programs as recruitment fronts, targeting vulnerable boys under the guise of discipline and spiritual clarity. The pattern was undeniable, the documents irrefutable. Although Ruman was never physically brought to trial, having been declared legally dead after a confirmed identity match from a cabin fire in Honduras in 2014, the court sentenced him posthumously, branding his legacy with the only justice left: truth made public. His assets, once scattered under shell identities, were frozen and redirected to fund trauma support for survivors of cult-based abuse. Outside the courthouse, Eloise stood beside her son, her hand on his shoulder, surrounded by reporters, flashbulbs, and the growing noise of a world finally listening. But her voice cut through it all when she said, "They weren't victims, they were messengers. We just had to hear them." In the months that followed, Elkhorn Valley High School underwent renovations funded partly by a state initiative for rural education reform. The gym was rededicated in a candlelight ceremony on a warm fall evening, with students, teachers, parents, and survivors filling the bleachers, not in silence, but in unity. On the far wall, beneath the new scoreboard, hung a large bronze plaque engraved with 6 names: Miles Rowan, Emery Chen, Travis Holt. Beneath the names was a single phrase carved by Miles himself: "We were never lost, we were taken, and we found each other." As the ceremony drew to a close, Eloise stood near the edge of the court, watching her son walk toward her through the crowd. He stopped in front of her, pulled something from his pocket, a wrinkled, weathered piece of paper from the journal he had written in the cave. He handed it to her silently. She unfolded it and read the line aloud, her voice strong. "If you're reading this, it means we made it." They embraced, the gym now glowing with soft light and quiet strength. Outside, the town of Elkhorn slept peacefully for the first time in years, its streets no longer haunted by questions, but illuminated by answers carved in sweat, sacrifice, and survival. That night, Miles stood on the school steps beside Emery and Jordan, their silhouettes tall against the moonlit sky. For a long time, none of them spoke. Then softly, Miles said, "Shay." "She never gave up." Emery nodded. "Neither did you." George smiled, still quiet but steady. "We were never supposed to survive, but we did." Eloise stood behind them, watching, heart full, tears on her cheeks, not of grief, but of reunion, of return. Later, at the small reception held in the school cafeteria, where old friends reunited and new bonds were forged, a student approached Miles with a shy expression and handed him a drawing, 6 figures standing in front of a cave, holding hands beneath a full moon. Miles knelt down and said, "What's this?" The boy replied, "It's you and your friends. You're heroes now." Miles smiled, eyes shimmering, and replied, "No, we're just the ones who got hurt." That night, Eloise lit a final candle on her windowsill, not for mourning, but for closure. The house no longer echoed with questions. It breathed peace. In her living room sat the box of tapes, journals, photos, archived, preserved, and ready to be donated to the new National Center for Youth Advocacy, where they would live, not as horror, but as history. And beside it, resting in a shadow box frame, was Miles's old jersey. Number 4, cleaned, folded, and illuminated by soft golden light, like the boy who wore it. She looked at it one last time and whispered, "You kept fighting. Now rest." If this story moved you, make sure to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next mystery we uncover. I'm curious, what part of the story hit you the hardest? Was it the cave carvings, the journals, or the final reveal? And where are you watching from right now? Drop a comment below. I read every single one.